So I've been thinking a lot about how to give a 2 or 3 sentence summary of the Crusades. Some people might need some context. So this is what I've come up with. The Crusades, a failed colonization of the Holy Land. Ultimately rebuffed over centuries. There were a lot of crusades, maybe 8, but people count them differently. Of that 8 plus, the First Crusade was by far the most successful. Like, there wasn't even a close second. And of the First Crusade, the most successful moment was the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. It's kind of the crown jewel of the First Crusade. So the Crusaders captured a lot of territory to the north of the city, and up to this point they were kind of undefeated. In June, the Crusaders arrived outside the city walls. It was the middle of summer and they didn't really have many supplies left. The Fatimid commander of Jerusalem had ordered all of the water wells outside of the city poisoned. There's also an account saying that he had all of the trees outside of the city cut down, but I find that kind of dubious. Either way, he was preparing for a siege, and he knew that the Crusaders were going to arrive exhausted. He was right. They had very little water and very little food. If they sat around and waited for the city to fall, people were going to start dropping dead. The Crusaders consulted a local holy man/hermit to figure out how to take the city. After speaking with him, they knew exactly what to do. The entire Crusader army marched around the city barefoot, singing religious songs. They then went up to Mount Zion, the Mount of Olives, and the Garden of Gethsemane, listening to sermons and losing themselves in religious ecstasy. The Crusader army was decentralized, with a bunch of dukes and counts, and no strong figurehead. The Dukes of Normandy, Flanders, and Bouillon formed up on the north side of the wall, while the Count of Toulouse took his men to the south wall. The first attack was made with no preparations beyond religious observances, and as you can imagine, they were easily driven back. They probably thought that this was a Jericho situation, with all of them marching around the walls and singing. That didn't happen. What did happen was this. English and Genoese ships showed up at exactly the right time. The Crusaders boarded these ships and stripped them bare. They took food, they took water, they took supplies, and then they tore the actual ships apart and took the wood. A few days later, the Crusaders formed up again, except this time they had 2 siege towers, one to the north and one to the south. The southern tower, the one under the command of the Count of Toulouse, was set on fire by the defenders, rendering it unusable. The men attacking the north wall, specifically the men under the Duke of Bouillon, reached the wall and broke through. The defenders pulled back to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Crusaders simply fell upon the city, indiscriminately slaughtering civilians. The sources are all over the map on how many were killed during this massacre, but it seems at least tens of thousands died. The Duke of Bouillon, who had spearheaded this attack and more or less took the city, was crowned the King of Jerusalem. Things essentially could not have gone better for the Crusaders. They achieved their goals with some setbacks, but really was a remarkable victory. They would hold Jerusalem for another 90 years, but the Crusader states would linger for centuries. What I think is interesting about this event is that under normal circumstances, the Crusaders probably would have died outside of the walls of Jerusalem. It was really dumb luck that the English and Genoese arrived when they did. The Crusaders were just sitting out there with no water and no food, just kind of expecting the city to fall into their hands. Without the capture of Jerusalem, there probably wouldn't have been any later Crusades. It's really interesting to me that history took this improbable left turn and somehow allowed the Crusaders to establish a foothold in the Holy Land.